So it's my pleasure to hand over to Simon as our MC for this evening. And he will, as it goes on, tell you about his story and proceed to the introduction of our keynote, Sir Joseph Williams. Simon.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good evening, everybody, and let me add my welcome to that of Bruce's. Apparently, every night, on average, I speak to around 800,000 people. That's what the numbers say. However, in the studio I sit in, there are only 4 people, and it feels like I'm in a living room. I have an auto cue there, and it is nowhere near as terrifying as speaking to you. This is personal. It's always tougher when it's personal. I can be professional. It is my great pleasure this evening to be here to introduce our keynote speaker, Justice Sir Joe Williams. A mere 4 days since he was knighted by the Governor-General in a formal investiture on his home marae at Manaia near Coromandel town. That is a rare privilege indeed. Only a handful of judges, only a handful of knights and dames. Well, tonight we're going to hear from Justice Sir Joe shortly and hopefully have some time at the end for some questions before a chance to not only add to the questions, but maybe some networking and add a little bit of networking on informally. As I age, I've found that my glasses don't work for the close-up stuff. I'm not one of those ones at the menu at the restaurant. I'm the other way around, so I'm going to take them off. You might not recognise me now. No makeup, no glasses. Who is this guy? Watch out, Jacinda, I'm coming. Before I introduce Joe, though, as you've heard, I've been asked to say a few words about my connection to Tauranga Moana. And it's quite simple. Ko Ngāti Pūkenga te iwi. I whakapapa to Ngāti Pūkenga, and I'm incredibly proud of that. I can trace my ancestry to my tūpuna back to Ngāti Pikiao of Te Arawa as well. So Te Arawa and Matatua, I acknowledge you and say, hello, cuz. My journey to discovering my whakapapa, though, has taken more than 20 years. It's been the product of my, I hesitate to say later adult life, my intermediate middle adult life, but it is to me, even more importantly, the journey of my dad. Like so many, he grew up in the mid-20th century, like many of you, a time when we were told New Zealand was a land of equality and opportunity for all. By the 60s, we were fed constant stories of New Zealand having one of the highest living standards in the world, rivaled only by the likes of America in its nascent phase and Switzerland. Supposedly, we were in their league. Supposedly, we were a paradise of prosperity where Maori and Pākehā walked side by side in racial harmony. But for so many working class and Maori in particular, it was all built on a myth and the insidious intergenerational effects of colonialism at play. Te reo Māori was neglected, even actively abandoned, as many Māori adopted the practice of suppressing their language out of fear that it marked them in some way, that it was a handicap to their children getting ahead in the Pākehā world. Everybody seemed to be happy. Speak English, boy, that's the key to your future. But what did it cost? In doing so, identity was lost. And a rootless generation drifted away from their language, away from their marae, away from their cultural practices, joining that urban drift of the time, the burgeoning urban drift into cultural anonymity and isolation. And Joe will no doubt touch more on this in the duration of his kōrero, but for my dad, it had a far deeper effect, as it did for many. For my dad, it extended to his Māori identity being actively and utterly suppressed. A World War I traumatized father actively banned his wife, my father's mother, from telling her 6 children that they were Māori at all. And despite their suspicion that they actually were, it was only revealed to him almost 50 years after his mother passed. A late night phone call to Talkback Radio revealed a deathbed instruction to find a missing member of a disrupted and disconnected family. And the long journey of discovery and reconnection began. With the help of a number of people, documentary researchers, librarians, Debbie, thank you, I embarked on this journey, and it brought me here to Tauranga, where I explored the native land court records for some hours. I remember with a really bad hangover. I don't want to tell you what happened the night before, because I remember that really well too. It involved John Key, by the way. And some swearing. And after this research, after a few red herrings and mistaken identities, about 10 years ago I had the privilege of bringing my parents and my children to meet their whānanga as we were welcomed onto our marae Te Whetū o Te Rangi at Welcome Bay. The barber that their mother had taken her boys to across town to see every school holidays. The man who later worked on the wharves with my uncle, and for years later confused my uncle when he'd once said, "It's a wise man boy who knows his grandfather," turned out to be their grandfather. His name was Ernie Te Kepa Pofiufiu Asher. And my father and his siblings never had an opportunity to get to know him. Despite that fundamentally sad historical frustration, my dad, though, was finally returned to the marae and the land of his tūpuna, and it filled him with pride, as it does me. I'm just going to take an aside from my notes here because it connects to the history. Ernie's grandparents were, of their time, a modern love story. Ernie's mother, Katarina Te Atiro, and father, David Asher, lived in Tauranga. At one point, David had the pub, which if I read between the lines, he lost due to gambling debts. But he was also a native land court interpreter. And he spoke fluent reo, and he acted as a bridge. And he was able to do that because of Ernie's grandparents. Ernie's maternal grandmother, Katarina's mother, was Rahira Te Kahuhiopo, a woman of mana and influence in the Western Bay of Plenty. It was said that her rohe, her area of influence extended from Maua, from the mount, to Te Puke. You could stand, what she could see as she looked east to Te Puke was hers. At the Battle of Gate Pa, when Wahine Māori extended sakua and help to wounded and injured British soldiers, which was a revelation for the time, she was one of them. Ernie's paternal grandfather, David Asher's father, had come to New Zealand as a merchant working for the Nathan family. And he extended down into this way. And while Ernie's grandmother had helped and given aid to wounded British soldiers, Ernie's grandfather, his paternal grandfather, had supplied the British soldiers with muskets and equipment. 10 years later, their children were to marry. What greater possibility for optimism can you have in a young nation that is at war with itself, that is battling internally, than to present the optimism of a warmonger and a Maori princess? Why have we lost the possibilities that those sort of things have presented to us? I'll take you back to jump forward to the mid-20th century and the effect of the suppression of identity and real. A prevailing social belief, a misplaced orthodoxy of the time, meant Dad and his siblings and so many others were denied their true identity and birthright. He was far from alone, of course. At the same time, a generation of Maori were being actively disconnected from their reo, the language taonga that underpins what it is to be, what it means to be Maori. The handicap of speaking te reo in a Pākehā world wrenched their identities away. And all humans, consciously or not, crave belonging to something larger than themselves. With the removal of language and culture, they're forced to seek belonging where they could find it. I mentioned the urban drift. It is a natural downstream byproduct of colonialism, and along with the Western belief that the individual is more important than the collective, the results of which we see, the effects of which we see in the rise of gangs. Most acutely and painfully for our society, the rise of gangs, offering a sense of belonging to the most disconnected and disenfranchised. We can do better. Right, this is not my speech, however. I'm going to leave the meat to Sir Joe. I hope you saw his interview on the breakfast program yesterday, because that was probably a better introduction than I could possibly give. Joe Williams was whāngai, raised by his great aunt and great uncle in Hastings, attending Lindisfarne College on scholarship. At Manaia on Saturday, the boys of Lindisfarne College came along and they gave a wonderful haka. And I didn't realise though until Joe thanked them that they were called Jaffas because of their red coats and brown skin. And I felt better because as an Aucklander, out of Tamaki Makaurau, it's good to know we're not the only Jaffas in town. Like me, Joe was the first in his family to go to university, initially completing a bachelor's in Te Reo before graduating, also like me, with a law degree in the same year, 1986. But there any similarities end. One of us went on to have a real and meaningful career, while the other became a talking head and an auto cue puppet. And the second most famous person in New Zealand after Jacinda, apparently. I could probably leave now because that's my highlight. But Joe moved rapidly through the law ranks as a stellar legal career unfolded. And I'll just take you through some of them quickly, any of which I'd be happy with. A master's degree in Canada, partner in a major law firm back here, then his own law firm, chief judge of the Maori Land Court at just 38. 5 years later, chair of the Waitangi Tribunal. In 2008, a judge of the High Court. 2018, the Court of Appeal. A year later, the Supreme Court. And from my very limited legal experience, I'm only too aware of the calibre of jurist it takes to reach these positions. And his authorship, his achievements and accolades, of which I've only mentioned a few, bear testimony to the heights he's reached. And what does he consider his finest achievement? None of those. He told attendees last weekend, and he said before, that it was the difference he was able to make in advancing tribal interests through the settlement process. He also said later on that his proudest achievement was his children, even though he had to be reminded to thank his wife and family at the conclusion of his kōrero after being knighted. And Lady Gillian's going to get some, Lady G, sorry, is going to get some pretty good mileage out of that for quite some time, I imagine. He has yet another dimension to really piss me off and make me jealous. He's also been a rock star. I wish he still had that hair. As a member of the band Aotearoa, he integrated his passion for Maori advancement with music, singing the reggae-influenced protest song Maranga Ake Ai, banned at the time and re-recorded last year because of the strength of its meaning of its lyrics for the Maori Party. He was a rock star. As his whanaunga Sam Makaurau said on the weekend, if the law thing doesn't work out, there's always work and income. In Te Ao Māori, there is a whakatauki, a saying, a proverb. Kaore te kumara, e kōrero ana o tōna reka. The kumara doesn't speak of its own sweetness. Don't brag. Be humble. Don't blow your own trumpet. So let me mix two cultures and languages and blow this kumara's trumpet for him. He's a man of humanity and humility, of intellect, insight and integrity, with a clear vision for a better life for his people and all of Aotearoa, and a vision of a country with a unique opportunity to integrate tikanga Māori into our legal system in a way that reflects who we are as a nation and a people and where we want to go. We're not Little Britain. Google tells me it's 433 kilometres from Waitangi to Tauranga, but it's also been 181 years. So how has the treaty treated Tauranga? With his thoughts on the treaty and Tauranga then and now, would you please welcome a man known to Ngāti Pūkenga, not just as Sir Joe now, but with that uniquely irreverent Māori humour as Sergio. And Sir Joe. Ladies and gentlemen, Tā Joe, Sir Joe Williams.
Papaki tuana ngā taiki maua o e whakanukunuku hi, ai whakanekeneke hi, ai whiwarere tia ahine rua ki te wai ki tai wiwi, ki tai wāwa, ti he mauri ora. Nō reira tauranga moana, tauranga tangata. Māori mai, Pākehā mai. Haere mai, haere mai, haere mai. O tiraia, mihi mai whakatau mai. Aha koa i kia te kōrero, ko te tūranga wāwai o tēnei atu atu nei, kei tuana, kei te tara o te ika, kei manaia, ara ke anō, tōna tūranga wāwai, ko te whetū o te rangi, ko ngā peke e maha o pūkei, ko ngā pāpaka o rangataua. Nō reira mihi mai tātou, kia tātou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. You know, I really think Jacinda is in trouble. I'm not sure what colour he might wear, but man, I was thinking while he was about halfway through that speech that, you know, we should just close it up at the end of it and go to the bar. I can't match that skill. It's probably the Asher thing. He name-checked some really important names in our history. Rahera te kahuhia pō. Now, those of you from within the Maori world know how much mana that woman had. And Kātarina te atirau. These are, in Ngāti Pūkenga and in Tauranga Moana history, names of such importance and mana. In fact, a cousin of mine who is from Ngāti Tūwharetoa, I'm not, but he's an Asher too, had a son in Honolulu. And you know what the son's name is? Te Atirau. Te Atirau. And it's reflective. Usually Maori people name their children as a way of making them do better. So you pick a mana name. You know, I mean, if we were a bit more faithful, Bishop, we'd have called all our sons Jesus and all our daughters Mary. So the fact that Te Atirau and Te Kahuhia Pō and Rahera are names that keep repeating and repeating and repeating down through the generations to now indicates this man's line. He's a chief. And I mean, it's a sad story that his chiefly status was covered like a blanket and hidden from him. But you can see why the people hugged him back into the community when they made that connection. It was kind of, I suspect, I wasn't there at the hui, but I suspect it was, oh good, come back, you're our leader. Anyway, Cuz, thank you so much for taking the time to come down just to introduce me, and in doing so to produce a speech that's about 10 times better than the one I've done. So thanks very much, I'll get you back. Okay, I thought, I'm not sure where you're all at in terms of treaty knowledge and so on, so I thought I might talk a little bit about some history, talk a little bit about some context, talk a little bit about the tauranga context, and talk as much as I can about where this journey seems to be taking us. I have to be careful about that because I'm a sitting Supreme Court judge. So whatever Joe Williams, the individual, might dream about for his country, Joe Williams, the judge, has to apply the law, and I'm going to be cautious about that. Bear with me. But those of you who know me know that I'm not particularly disciplined. So we'll see where this takes us. Okay. And so I haven't got a watch on me, so someone needs to... what's the time now? 5 to 7. I'll try and keep this to half an hour-ish. Does that suit you? And then what I'd really like to do is to have a conversation with you. It seems to me presumptuous to walk in and say, the treaty and tauranga, this is your future, because who the hell am I? What I'm interested in hearing is what the people of tauranga have in mind for a treaty-based future, I suppose, and the challenges that might present. And I'm under no illusion as to those challenges. So, first of all, by 1840, as many of you will know, after all, you're the Tauranga History, Western Bay Historical Society, something like that. By 1840, Tauranga had been the subject of maybe 20 years of warring. We can't forget that, it's important. And although in the Pākehā world generally, those wars from around 1820 through to 1840, and here a little after 1840, are not widely spoken of, in the Maori world they remain defining events in the history of the tribes, including the history of the Tauranga tribes. So you had musket-armed Ngāpuhi and Marutuahu raiding down here to Ongare at the western end, to Te Papa, of course, o Tamataha, much later in the process, where the body count was enormous, frankly. And often people sort of point to the musket wars and say, see, that's what happens when you give them weapons, look what they do. But then people forget about the 30 Years' War in Europe, the First World War, the 7 Years' War, and those body counts. And we kind of remember that, after all, we're humans. And Māori, no less nor more than anyone else. Then there were the wars between Tauranga and Ngāti Haua on one side, from the Matamata side of the Kaimais, Te Waharoa, and Te Arawa, over Te Tumu and Maketu, which many of you will know about. And interestingly, my people, Ngāti Pukenga, were on the Te Arawa side of that battle. We were always a little, we were pretty untrustworthy then and now. And my tupuna, of course, Te Tumu was attacked by Te Waharoa and Ngāti Haua and Ngaiterangi. And this was a very well defended pā, but it had 60 fighters inside it and their families, and 1,600 fighters outside it without their families. And even a well-defended pā just couldn't cope with that sort of asymmetry, we would say. So my tupuna, Nainai, along with almost everyone in that pā, lost their lives. Now these events are butting up hard against the treaty discussion. And of course Albert Nesbitt Brown comes into Te Papa to spread the gospel, but it kind of doesn't go that well here compared with other places. By the 1840s, much of Ngāpuhi was Christianized. It was in 1814 that Marsden arrived at Rangihaua and offered the first church service on Christmas Day, 1814, and said, e te iwi kau e wehi no te mea, i tēnei rau, i te pā o rāwiri, i whānau mai a karaiti ihu, hei kai whakaora i a tātou. And Ruatara Marsden didn't say they couldn't speak Māori. Ruatara said that. Marsden actually said, taking from Luke chapter 2, verse 11, fear not, people, for on this day in the city of David. And interestingly, that's translated, i te pā o Rāwiri. In Rāwiri's pā. That's how Ruatara translated it. On this day in the city of David was born Christ Jesus, as a saviour for us all. Now, I'm sorry, Bishop, I know that's only a paraphrase, but that's the guts of it. Introducing this idea, and I think it's fair to say, that we have to accept the colonization process was not one way, was not a one-way value transfer. This idea of an individual redemptive God was an extraordinarily revolutionary idea for Maori who saw atua in an entirely different way. And that idea, seeded and carried over the next 15 odd years, was an important reason for the end of northern aggression. So anyway, but obviously the good news hadn't got down to Tauranga, and the Reverend Brown let Hobson and co know, and who was the other guy? Shortland, know that he wasn't optimistic that he would get too many signatures here in Tauranga because the tribes were at war and the gospel had not been freely embraced by all of the tribes. So, on the 1st of April, a copy of the treaty is sent down by ship to the Reverend Brown, and he manages over a month or so to secure 21 signatures. All of them you can see up there. Those are the Tauranga signatures. On the copy of the treaty he had, all of those signatures are Ngaiterangi, except two. The two are Te Kapa from Ngaitamarawaho, Pere. Yeah, that gun guitar. I didn't even know. I've known Pere for years. I didn't even know he was that good on that guitar. His tupuna, Te Kapa, and my great, can't remember how many, grandfather, Te Kaurehua. So let me just point out. From, I'll come over here so you can see it on that side. Yeah. Te Kau Tana Tohu. Te Kau, his sign. So that's my ancestor's hand right there. And that's the name of the ancestral house in Manaia, Te Kaurehua. Named because, for events that we needn't detain us here, he took a section of Ngāti Pūkenga from Ngāpeke, from Welcome Bay, and settled them over the other side of the Hauraki Peninsula at Manaia. And there we are still. But those people from Manaia are indistinguishable in whakapapa terms from the people of Whetū at Welcome Bay. So, things weren't going that well in Tauranga in terms of collecting the signatures, and so Major Bunbury from, I can't remember the name of the regiment, a professional soldier, is sent down in May by Willoughby Shortland, who's the acting governor at the time, because some of you will know that Hobson had a stroke. He became very sick after the 6th of February. He'd had a stroke. He was basically incapacitated. And Willoughby Shortland, the protector of Aborigines, he was called, is sent down as acting governor. Is acting governor and sends Bunbury down to see if he can collect up a few more signatures. Crucially, he fails completely. Gets no more signatures than the 21 that are listed there, including my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Crucially, Tupaia refuses to sign because he doubts the Crown's ability to enforce any kind of peace. And you've got to remember, there are musket balls crisscrossing across Tauranga Moana at this very time. And he decides that he says the Crown does not have the ability to protect my authority. Only I do. So he refuses to sign. And of course, the other tribes that are involved in these fights, Te Arawa and Tūwharetoa in particular, also refuse to sign. Now, the context of that is, I think, the wars that are going on at that very time, in which the Crown seems to signal that it lacks the ability to intervene in a decisive manner to prevent the warfare. So the chiefs say, well, if the Queen can't do it, what's the point in signing the piece of paper? But there are 21 signatures, and that's a lot of Ngaiterangi chiefs. That's definitely the ariki of Ngāti Pūkenga. I can attest to that. I don't know much about the kapa of Tamarawaho, but Pere will probably tell you. So, I mean, Tūpaia missing is kind of like the US refusing to sign the climate change accord. You know, it does undermine the climate change accord. There's no doubt about that. Nonetheless, the climate change accord is important. And nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that in Tauranga, this level of attachment, adhesion to the treaty is nonetheless significant. So, what does this document say? Well, and you know, it's funny, we talk about the treaty all the time in Aotearoa. It's been a top 10 or 20 political issue in Aotearoa since 1840, in fact, one way or another. But little is known amongst the general populace about what the document actually says. And it's kind of a humble document. The English text is pretty straightforward, written in lawyerly language, written as if a lawyer wrote it, written in that concise common law English that you would expect in the 19th century, second half of the 19th century empire. Sovereignty is ceded to Her Majesty Queen Victoria, the new Queen, in return for her promise to protect the exclusive and undisturbed possession of their lands, forests and fisheries, and such of their other properties as they may individually or collectively possess, for as long as they wish to retain the same, subject to Crown preemption. And there was quite a fight about what Crown preemption meant, because actually, in law, preemption is the right of first refusal, whereas what colonial law says is that the Crown's right is that of a monopsony. You know, it's the flash word for monopoly, buyer. So only the Crown can buy, right? So, Article 1, you're the government now. Article 2, I promise your real estate and your resources will be protected for as long as you want to keep them. But if you want to sell them, you have to sell it to me. And Article 3, and I promise you all the rights and privileges of British subjects. Now, often Article 3 is undervalued, but you've got to remember what was going on at the time, because despite these brutalizing musket wars, these tribes, particularly north of East Cape, were engaged in pretty vigorous trade, particularly with Melbourne and Sydney. And a number of leading chiefs owned or leased schooners, trading into those ports. Poipiripi, it was called, Port Phillip, Melbourne. Poihākena, Port Jackson, it's now called Sydney, but Port Phillip and Port Jackson are still there. And they paid customs duty to get in there, because New Zealand wasn't a British possession. So it was actually really good for those chiefs to be able to claim British citizenship as they could, so they didn't have to pay customs duties when they traded into Sydney and Melbourne. So let's not underestimate the power of Article 3. So there you go. Sovereignty, subject to protection of all your resources and real estate, and British citizenship. The Maori text didn't really say that, as many of you I expect will know. What's transferred is kawanatanga. Now, kawanatanga is transliteration with a Maori nominalisation at the end of it. Kawana is governor, of course, you can hear it. Tanga, governorship, whatever that meant. Well, they kind of did know what that meant because Pilate was the governor of Palestine. And the Gospels referred to Pilate as Te Kawana or Iharaira, from memory. So they knew that whatever was being transferred, it was no little thing. It was an important thing that was being transferred. But that was in return for the promise of te tino rangatiratanga o rātou whenua, o rātou kāinga, me o rātou taonga katoa. So actually, even the list of things protected differs in the Maori from the English. The English is lands, forests and fisheries, right? Exclusive and undisturbed possession of your lands, forests and fisheries. And I remember at the time, the Waitangi Tribunal, when the fisheries debate was going on, the Waitangi Tribunal said the problem with the English text of the treaty is not that it's imprecise about the fisheries guarantee. The problem is that it's all too precise. It's everything. And that's not going to work, interestingly enough. So you'll see the English legal language and then the very different approach in the Māori. Te tino rangatiratanga o rātou whenua o rātou kāinga me o rātou taonga katoa. The tino rangatiratanga, whatever that might mean, of their lands, their villages, and all of their treasured things, or all of their properties. Taonga is both a big word and a narrow word at once, depending on the context within which it is used. So what is this tino rangatiratanga? Well, it's obvious, it seems to me, that tino rangatiratanga is a bigger word than kawanatanga. Very obvious. Why is that? Well, thy kingdom come in the Lord's Prayer was translated kia tae mai, and still is, kia tae mai tau rangatiratanga. So God's kingdom was rangatiratanga, and what Hobson got was Pilate. Right? You've got to put yourself in the context. These chiefs were armed to the teeth. Much better armed than the British, much better organised. I mean, Ngāpuhi, that signed this thing in 1840, had just maintained 3 campaigns running south all the way to Wellington and back up, in which they kind of cleared the place out. These guys could wage war. They were territorial soldiers that only fought during the summer, during the summer, and then while their crops were growing, and then went home to rest in the winter. So they weren't, the Queen's regiment, but they knew how to fight. They were very experienced soldiers. So it's not actually that surprising that the guarantee was not of your right to real estate, your right to own property, but your self-government. It's not at all surprising that that would be the case, because any attempt to say you didn't have it would be met that way. Because these guys were the kings. There's just no question about that. So, to avoid being ahistorical about it, we do have to understand that the chiefs knew that the British Empire was this powerful thing and it was coming, but that didn't mean that they were powerless or felt powerless. They did not. So for them, the driver was mana. And tino rangatiratanga is all about mana. All about mana. And that's because it's in Māori. And mana in te ao Māori was and is everything. So although Pilate was had the kawanatanga, the governorship, Roman imperial authority was translated in the Bible as te rangatiratanga o Roma. So, and if we sit in the context, we can see that that's not that surprising. Now, there's more to it than that, because Aotearoa wasn't the first or last place to be colonised. Colonisation had been going since 1492, and British colonisation since the 16 or 1700s, depending on when you push your start button. And the Brits had kind of worked out a series of principles or rules by which they went about doing this stuff. So at the end of the 7 Years' War in the US, well, actually between France and England, most of it fought in the US, but actually elsewhere as well. It was kind of a world war between the French Empire and the British Empire. At the end of that, George III issued the Royal Proclamation of 1763, in which he stopped British expansion beyond the Appalachians. He said, whatever's happening from now, whatever has happened up until now, you will now retreat back east of the Appalachians, which is, quite a way east on the North American continent. And we will respect the title of the Indians for the remaining areas. You will not attempt to buy, treat, or take their lands. This was called the famous Royal Proclamation of 1763, the first British indication that it respected Indigenous title. And in the US post the Revolution, there were the famous Cherokee cases in the 1830s. Just before Jackson ordered the removal, the so-called Trail of Tears, that shifted the eastern tribes from Florida, Carolina, the Cherokee in particular, the Chickasaw, Choctaw, out of that southeastern US area to Oklahoma, where they still are, by what was called the Trail of Tears. But before that happened, the Cherokee went to court to say, Georgia, the state of Georgia, can't kick us out. This is our whenua. They have no authority over us. We are sovereign and self-governing. And that issue got to the US Supreme Court in a famous trilogy of cases called the Cherokee cases, in which Chief Justice Marshall said, the Cherokee are sovereign on their soils and when we refer to them as nations, we use that word in the same way that we would refer to nations in Europe. They are self-governing and sovereign. But he called them domestic dependent nations. That is, they are subject to federal control. The important thing about the Cherokee cases, because they are being discussed at the time that the treaty is developing, the important thing about the Cherokee cases is that they indicate, along with the Royal Proclamation, that Indigenous title, native title, will be respected in British colonial law, and native sovereignty will be respected in British colonial law. Then, of course, President Andrew Jackson refused to enforce the judgment and removed the Cherokee westwards, but the legal principle has remained ever since and remains the case today, including in the very famous case just recently over the status of the western end of the state of Oklahoma. I just can't remember the name of the case now, but it came out last year. Anyway, and this is the time when slavery is abolished, 1832, on the British side, and William Wilberforce is on the rise. There is a new humanitarianism on the British side, and the Church Missionary Society, the CMS, is powerful in the British Parliament. And that's the context within which we see this draft getting prepared, in which, no surprises, real estate rights are guaranteed, because the Royal Proclamation had said that since 1863, and in which, interestingly in the Maori text, nationhood or sovereignty or self-government or tino rangatiratanga was guaranteed in the Maori text. So nothing in that treaty was in any way new And that's important to understand. What then was the Maori perspective? Well, I've thought hard about this because this is, I mean, we debate about what's in the text, right? What does sovereignty mean? Kawanatanga, what does exclusive and undisturbed possession? Rangati, how do they work together? What's going on here? But we never ask ourselves, at least don't ask ourselves enough, what those chiefs were thinking, what my great-great-great-great-grandfather was thinking when he signed up, other than getting the red blanket. Because they didn't belong to a contractual culture. The idea that you would write stuff down and that would be binding and final was completely foreign to this culture. And we run the risk of misunderstanding what happened here if we get too fixated on the words and terms of the document. Now, there's no question that these chiefs were interested in the protection of their mana and the creation of an alliance with an apparently more powerful friend to enhance their mana in return for concessions to the powerful friend. That seems to me to be clear. But this is a culture whose drivers are relational, not contractual. The idea of a written contract is just completely foreign. Of course, literacy had grown considerably since the first arrival of the missionaries in 1814, but they were still very deeply Maori. So no one was poring over the words saying, what do you mean by tino rangatiratanga? Or what do you mean by exclusive and undisturbed possession? Because for them, this was the creation of a relationship. And the key ideas here were whanaungatanga, the creation of a kinship relationship with Victoria and with what the Maori saw as her metaphorical descendants, Hobson and so on and so forth, right? For them, the treaty was about creating a relationship of mutual advantage which had to be fed and refed every day to keep it alive, and if it wasn't, it would die. And in terms of tikanga Māori, if it died, that's the end, you walk away. So we have to remember that what these chiefs were talking about was creating a whanaungatanga-style alliance, just as they had been doing for all of the hundreds of years they'd been in Aotearoa, and actually just as they had been doing for the thousands of years in northern Polynesia, that they had been there before getting to Aotearoa. And the point in the whanaungatanga relationship was mana. Mana a iwi, mana a hapu. That was the point. If your mana was not going to be enhanced, the mana of your hapu, the mana of your iwi was not going to be enhanced, then there was no point in doing this. And if you track through the comments that are being made in the treaty discussions all through the country, you'll see these things being discussed constantly. Some doubting the Crown's bona fides, some saying, well, we have to trust them because change is coming. None of them ever saying, we concede that you will be the chief now and we will just be the people. No one, that not entering anyone's heads, let alone Governor Hobson's. So, later on, as you well know, that's not how it panned out. There were cases in the latter half of the 19th century after the land wars that dealt with the problematic language of the treaty in terms of what was actually going on by writing it out of the legal discourse, by saying, as Chief Justice Prendergast did in the famous case of Wiparata and the Bishop of Wellington, this is a nullity. It's a simple nullity having been entered into with savages who lacked the capacity to enter into it. This is the language he uses, he doesn't muck around. These are savages, they simply did not have sovereignty, and therefore this treaty is not worth the paper that it's written on. Later on, in the famous case of Hoani Te Hauhau Tūkino and the Aotea District Māori Land Board in 1942 in the Privy Council, the Privy Council said, well, yeah, it's a treaty, Prendergast, come on, it's a treaty. But the thing about treaties is they're not directly enforceable in the law. And so the result is the same. And as a result, Ngāti Tūwharetoa lost about 100,000 acres of land, which was taken from them to pay a debt to the Waitomo Box Company, I think it was called, that had been incurred by a government official administering their lands on their behalf, the Aotea District Māori Land Board. Not themselves, the Aotea District Māori Land Board, a government organisation, got into hopeless debt and lost Te Hauhau and Ngāti Tūwharetoa's land. And Te Hauhau went to the Privy Council saying, you can't do that, it's in breach of the treaty, and you can't make laws that breach the treaty. And the law lords in London said, I'm sorry, yes you can. That's a treaty, but that doesn't matter. All right. So we got to this point where by the beginning of the 20th century, it was really clear that the only way the treaty could be given effect was via Parliament. The settler Parliament had to enact legislation to give effect to it because the common law would not do it. The courts would not do it. And for the, 75 years from 1870 through to the middle of the 20th century, we know the history of what happened. And it's important to understand that this history is far from unique. It's a form of history that plays out in slightly different ways, but with generally the same effect in all of the Anglo-settled colonies of the world. And, you can't even blame the Brits, because the Spanish did it, the Dutch did it, the Germans did it, the French did it. So it just was the way things were. But here, using the veneer of legality, the settler government set about asset stripping the native owners of their land as cheaply as possible. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And in Europeanising the individuals whose assets they stripped. Again, this was the same everywhere. If you've heard of the stolen generations in Australia, if you've heard of the Indian schools issues in Canada, they were really precisely the same. And as my cousin, Mr. Dello, indicated, those policies over a space of 4 generations or so were extraordinarily effective. In the case of my father, making an active decision that there was no point in him speaking Maori in our home, because the language we had to learn was English, and he regretted that he wasn't better at English because he knew he had suffered as a result. And the even worse example of Simon's grandfather, for whom they actively suppressed the very idea of their DNA. Now, it's just important to understand, and I'm not intending to be controversial or provocative at all, that this was the point. It's important to remember that. This was the point. That if you had a colonisation process which involved shifting the British diaspora to another country, whether it's Canada, Australia or New Zealand, you needed to displace the prior inhabitants, or it wasn't going to work. And in displacing the prior inhabitants, you needed to assimilate them into your system, or you'd have continuing problems. It's just, if you're looking at it from that perspective, it's just good policy to do that. If that was your objective, then you'd better do it that way, or you're just going to have continuing problems, right? But the problem was that there was a whole series of collateral effects which showed up in the urbanised generations of the 70s, the children of those who urbanised, the children of those who first moved to the cities in the 60s and 70s and 80s. In the process of one generation, Te Ao Māori became the most urbanised Indigenous people in the world. About 75% of a burgeoning population. You remember the Maori population fell in about 1880 to 40,000. By the 1970s, it was 10% of a population of around 3 million back in those days, I think. 10%. And the Maori baby boomer generation was a boom. It was, according to demographers like Poole, the fastest growing population in the world. The Maori population was the fastest growing population in the world in the 60s and 70s. So I saw. I mean, you'll have to check the numbers, but having been the result of that, I grew pretty quick, I can tell you. Now, those who moved to the cities tried to recreate the structures that they'd walked away from because there was no longer a living there, urban maraes, the churches and so on. But they struggled because the cultural fabric, the cohesion of their communities had been so damaged. And what happened was the next generation, my generation, I was born in 1961, were the ones who I think probably suffered the consequences because we were the first generation living as a minority, the first ever Maori minority in a community, if you like. Before that, while Maori were a minority in the country, they weren't a minority in their villages, right? Their circumstances were always Maori. And so the generation that moved to the cities were generally Maori speaking, bilingual, and culturally Maori, right? My generation were the first generation to be visibly a minority and without their language. And the result of that, we can look back and see it as inevitable, was the radicalization of that group. The marches led by the young people, not the old people. Of course, Whenua was there. The Land March was a young people-driven thing. The occupations at Raglan, at Orake, all driven by the younger generation. The marches in respect of the Maori language in the 70s and 80s, the Springbok Tour in 81, in which there was strong Maori participation in the anti-tour movement, as well as strong Maori participation in the pro-tour movement, the Maori union lovers. But what I think New Zealand came to see was that the price that had been paid for the success of the colonial project was a dislocated and angry generation that needed to be better managed, or we were in trouble, because this was a large group. And I don't know, I mean, back in those days, things are much better now, but back in those days, there were Maori radicals being trained in Libya and Cuba. This was a real thing. And Wellington was right to be worried that something needed to be done. And what did happen, of course, was the creation of the Waitangi Tribunal in 1975, the recognition of the Maori language as an official language in the early 80s, and so on and so forth. And from 1984 on, quite a significant shift in the way the settler state dealt with the Maori presence. Actually very clever and very effective as a means of neutralizing the worst effects of the anger of that urban generation while keeping the dream alive within that generation. Now this was if you look at what happened in the US during this period, you can see how miraculous this was here. Because the US never got it right with the civil rights movement, whether with the indigenous people or with the equivalent result of slavery. And they're still paying that price. Here, because we're smaller and more intimate, the leaders of the Maori protest movement had kind of a direct connection to and line of communication with the ninth floor of the Beehive and the Secretary of Maori Affairs and so on. So discussions could take place and ways of ameliorating the problems could be developed. The Waitangi Tribunal came out of that, but lots and lots of other things did too, the results of which we are still seeing. The creation of the treaty settlement process in the mid-1980s. The famous lands case in the Court of Appeal, the New Zealand Court of Appeal, 1987. Puao Te Atatū, the inquiry led by the chief of Tūhoe, Te Rangiho, over social welfare treatment of Maori children, 1986-87, that led to the Children and Young Persons, Their Families Act, 1989. Something we're still confronting now. What Te Rangiho said, interestingly, in that panel, was exactly what Maori leaders are saying now. Let us, give us the tools, let us deal with it. You're making the problem worse. The tribes organised around environmental protection. Creation of the Huakina Development Trust in the Waikato with the wonderful, wonderful Ngāneko Minhinik that led to the courts accepting that the Treaty of Waitangi was relevant to water takes and led ultimately to the passing of the Resource Management Act, the protection of the unique indigenous relationship between Maori people, their lands, waters, and other wāhi tapu in Section 6, and the recognition of kaitiakitanga in Section 7 of that Act, and so on and so forth. The enactment of a piece of environmental legislation that is still the most significant integration of indigenous values and beliefs into mainstream environmental regulation in the Western world. The enactment of the cultural assessment processes that became Section 27 of the Sentencing Act. The active acceptance that cultural background and history is relevant to the way in which you deal with offenders for whom at least a part of the explanation for their offending is this history that I've talked about. The insertion of a treaty clause in the Conservation Act, which meant 30% of the country under DOC control is subject to directly enforceable treaty obligations. The insertion of treaty obligations into the Education Act, affecting preschool, primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Changes to intellectual property legislation, to the Patents Act, to the Trademarks Act. The creation of Indigenous advisory committees to advise the Commissioner of Patents and the Commissioner of Trademarks. Now, you might think, well, that doesn't sound very flash, but these patents and these Maori patents and trademarks advisory bodies deal with hundreds and hundreds of applications a year. And it seems, as far as I know, to work really well. And then you've got treaty settlements themselves, the creation of, ultimately, we haven't finished yet, but 50, 60 tribal organisations with asset bases, with governance regimes that they've chosen for themselves to act as the voice of their people, to attempt, if that's still possible, to reconstruct that which has been lost, to recollect their people who have been disconnected from them for generations now as a matter of government policy. So, from 1840 through to 1984, I guess, I think that's probably a good place to put it, 1984, the whole game was to strip out the assets and disconnect the people in order to individualise them so that they would integrate into the new regime. That proved disastrous for the Indigenous people, as it has proved disastrous everywhere in the world that has been tried. And from 1984 onward, we decided to take a different approach. First, very tentatively, and then more recently, with quite a bit of momentum and speed. And this comes down to, I think, I've talked too long. This comes down to, I think, this central idea that I admit was relatively modern, of partnership. There are a lot of Māori who say, no, I don't, you talk about partnership, what about tino rangatiratanga? What about taonga? And that's fair. But what's important to remember is what Panakareo and Te Kēmara and Tāmati Wākanene, Te Kaurehua, all of those chiefs had in mind. And what they had in mind was the building of a horizontal relationship with this new order. Not a vertical one, not a citizen to sovereign, but a horizontal relationship. The record is so clear about that. And interestingly, when the Court of Appeal judges in 1987 came up with this idea of the treaty being essentially a partnership, what they did was, I don't think they did it on purpose, doubt whether they knew the history, was go back to that relational idea. That was what was driving the old people. And this does separate us from what's happened elsewhere in the Anglo-colonized world. Because if you go to Canada or the US, and even more so in Australia, the underlying principles of Indigenous law are the fiduciary obligation in Canada, or the trustee obligation in the US. Trustee obligation between the federal government and the First Nation, or the fiduciary obligation between the federal government in Canada and the First Nation. And what's important about those sorts of obligations is that in order for them to work, you need a power imbalance. You need one to be strong and the other to be weak. Trustee, beneficiary, fiduciary, I don't know what the, fiducie, I don't know. The whole point in that kind of law is that whoever is the fiduciary and whoever is the trustee has power over you that you can't control, and therefore the law holds you to a higher standard of behaviour. Now, in New Zealand, we never bought that, interestingly. What we bought was the idea of partnership. Now, the cool thing about a partnership is that it is not premised on a power imbalance. You still have very important obligations. You've got utmost good faith, active protection, all of that stuff, which you also see in these other systems. But the image is like that, not like that. And that sets us apart. And in my view, I'm saying this as a Maori rather than as a judge, that's the idea that gives us hope. All of us, not just for the Maori, but for everybody. See, I think what's been going on since 1985 and what the partnership idea has given us is a chance to decolonize, to get the you've got no power, you're individualized, just be an individual within the wider community, a chance to put that to one side for a moment and imagine a different kind of reality. When I grew up, New Zealand was in the mid-Atlantic. Well, close to Britain actually, pretty closer to Britain than the US. But when I went to the movies as a 7 or 8 year old, you had to stand up when they played God Save the Queen. Do you remember that? I'm looking at this audience here, most of you remember that. And you had to stand up, and no one sat down. I mean, and as time went on, we kind of shifted out into the Atlantic and moved closer to the US. And we weren't the only ones floating around in the Atlantic. Australia was there too, in the end closer to the US than we were. But I think what's been going on since the mid-1980s is we've remembered we're in Polynesia. We're in the southern point of the Polynesian Triangle. And that means, whether we like it or not, all of us, not just you people with Polynesian DNA, but all of us, are by definition Polynesians. Every single one of us. Now, just think of the possibilities of that, because this ain't a one-way street. This ain't about, this is how we be nicer to the Maoris because we've been mean to them. This is about an exchange of values. And that's the cool thing about this idea. I remember, as I was thinking about these things, young people don't have this stuff anymore because they've got computers, but you used to have these flat cards, and if you held them up in one direction, they'd produce one picture, and if you turned it slightly, you'd get another picture. They were called, yes, the old people were going, yeah, yeah, yeah. These were called 3D holograms, I'm told. You know, and you'd have someone crying and then someone smiling. You know, you'd have a man with, you know, an old fat guy like me, and then someone cute in a bikini, if you know, that sort of thing. But the cool thing about it was all on one card in one space. And where we're heading to is that, where we have on one space a multitude of possibilities, a multitude of ways of thinking about who we are and where we are, how we act. We have the possibility of living in a country with a contractual system of law and a relational system of law. The possibility of a country that is English speaking and Maori speaking. Possibility of a country where you can own property and land, and you can say the land is my ancestor at the same time, and make those ideas meld into something that is bigger and better than both of them individually. It's not sort of stripping out one idea and chucking it away and replacing it with another. It's learning to be schizophrenic, just like that hologram. Oh, are we being protested against? And I don't know whether you know, but when I travel around the world, as I used to, everyone looks to Aotearoa as the place that seems to have got it. If I go to Australia, I've sort of given talks about the treaty settlement process to Australians, which here would be... And there, well-meaning Australians cry. Cry. And they say, I mean, what we've heard has transformed our way of thinking. And yet to us, you know, we've been doing this for a generation. And we've really only just started. So we seem to have, you know, to take that Alan Kerno idea, we seem to be working out how to stand upright in this upside-down world that we live in by being upside down and upright at the same time, by thinking papatuanuku and freehold title at the same time, by thinking wanganui te tupuna and hydroelectricity at the same time, in the same space, by managing those two things in balance. And no one else has done that. No one else has got that right. So I'm not underestimating the difficulty of this. There will be lots of conflict to go, lots of tension to go, because these things are really difficult. But the values that the Maori side of the bargain brings, the values that Kupe brings to the discussion, are potentially the values that will save us from wrecking where we live. And more, the New Zealanders I speak to are hungry for that. That's why we have a record number of Te Reo Māori classes in this country, and you can't get into any of them. And it's not Māoris, there are lots of Māoris doing it, but the bulk of those people are Pākehā, or Somalis, or Indians. And the beauty of that, and then I'll stop. The beauty of that is that it sheds the thing that got us into this mess in the first place. It stops us thinking of each other as other. Learn Te Reo Māori and you are welcomed into Te Ao Māori. And when you are welcomed into Te Ao Māori, we understand one another. We understand what those chiefs were trying to achieve, and the Māori side understands better what you're trying to achieve, and we will discover, I am certain, that the distance between us is about half a step. Tēnā tātou katoa.